So, this is our first lesson in the study of heredity, and we begin by talking about Gregor Mendel, who is considered the father of heredity. We need to talk about some vocabulary words before we get into the lesson, just so we kind of have a base for what we're talking about. So, allele is one of two or more difference of the same gene. So, alleles, for example, are blue eyes, brown eyes, curly hair, straight hair. It's just the characteristic that you have from a gene. A dominant allele, you probably talked about dominant and recessive traits in middle school. Dominant is the allele that masks the presence of another allele for the same gene when they occur together in a heterozygote. So this is the more common gene. Genetics is the study of heredity and just tells us how genes work. Genotype is the alleles an individual inherits at a particular genetic locus. So these are the possible traits based on the parent's traits. So if dad has brown eyes and mom has blue eyes, these are the possibilities of what you could get. Heterozygote and homozygote. Hetero means different, homo means same. So heterozygotes are organisms that get two different alleles for a given gene. So a different possible trait from each parent. Like you got curly hair from mom and straight hair from dad. Homozygote is an organism that gets the same alleles from each parent. So like dad has straight hair, mom has straight hair. Hybrid is offspring that results from a cross between two different types of parents. So an example would be a mule. A mule is the product of a horse and a donkey, and it has some traits of horses and some traits of donkeys. The law of independent assortment is Mendel's second law, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more. But it says that factors controlling different characteristics are inherited independently of each other. So like your hair color from your dad does not determine your eye color necessarily. You could get your eye color from your mom. And it's important to remember that different offspring have different possible characteristics from the same two parents. The law of segregation is Mendel's first law, and it says the factors controlling a characteristic separate and go to different gametes. Remember that in anaphase, the sister chromatids pull the opposite ends of the cell as the cell is getting ready to divide. And so a different set of traits go to each end of that cell. A locus is a position of a gene on a chromosome, just a specific point on that particular chromosome. Phenotype, so genotype was what you could get from your parents. Phenotype is the characteristic that is actually observed about you. It's the characteristic based on which of the genotypes is expressed. So this will get into the dominant recessive traits also. Pollen are grains that have male gametes of seed plants, and they transfer sperm to the female reproductive structures. Pollination is that process in which pollen is transferred to the female gametes in an ovary. And a recessive allele, we talked about dominant, so recessive is the one that is masked. It does not show up commonly. So we know that offspring are similar to their parents, but inheritance of traits was not understood until Gregor Mendel. And Mendel's discoveries are the basics of the study that we now call genetics. Mendel was a monk born in Austria in 1822. He went to college at the University of Vienna and studied science and math. So when he got to his monastery, they assigned him to work in the garden. And he did some experiments with pea plants, which have the scientific name Pisum sativum. Before Mendel, there was a theory that offspring have a blend or mix of the characteristics of the parents. So if you had a red plant and a white plant, all of the offspring of that plant would be pink. Mendel noticed that this wasn't true for pea plants or for his plants. So he experimented with almost 30,000 pea plants. He chose pea plants because they are fast growing, they are easy to raise, they have visible characteristics that vary, and each characteristic has two common values. So he looked at pea plants and he said, okay, they have white and purple flowers, they have yellow or green seeds, those seeds can be wrinkled around. He had two traits for everything. Mendel had to control pollination or fertilization to do his experiments because pea plants are naturally self pollinating. They normally drop pollen from the male's structure down into the female structure. So, in order to control this, Mendel removed the reproductive parts, the male parts of some of the plants, and pollinated the plants by hand with pollen that he selected. So, the result was hybrid offspring. Mendel began by changing one characteristic at a time and started with flower color. He crossed purple plants and white plants. The parent plants were called the P generation, and then the offspring were called F or filial generations. What Mendel noticed was when he crossed that purple and white, the first generation of offspring had no white flowers, and he wondered why that was the case. Then he allowed that generation to self-pollinate, and in F2, the second generation of offspring, he found that there were white plants again, but there was 3 purple plants to every white plant. He conducted experiments for all 7 characteristics of the pea. So he looked at seed form, seed color, flower color, pod form, pod color, the location of the stem, and the size of the stem. One value he found was always absent in the first generation of offspring, but it reappeared in the second generation. So there were always 75% of plants with one trait and 25% of plants with the other trait. So Mendel determined there are 2 factors controlling a given characteristic. One of those is dominant, and those factors separate into different gametes during reproduction. So Mendel wondered whether different characteristics were inherited together. He investigated 2 characteristics at a time. So he was crossing 2 things like seed color or seed shape instead of just seed color or seed shape. What he found was that all F1 plants were alike. They all produced yellow round seeds. But when he allowed those to self-pollinate, the F2 plants had all combinations of the 2 characteristics. Some were round, some were wrinkled, some were yellow, some were green, and there were different combinations of this. So combinations of the second generation were not present in the previous 2 generations. Mendel continued his experiments with other combinations of characteristics, and each time the results were the same. He found 75% of one trait, 25% of the other trait. So he said the factors controlling different characteristics are inherited independently of each other. So seed color had no bearing on seed shape. They were separate traits. When Mendel published his work in 1866, it was called Experiments in Plant Hybridization, and most people really didn't care. They just didn't pay attention to it. It wasn't anything earth-shattering at the time. Mendel took his work and sent study kits to other scientists to get them to repeat his experiments and see if they got the same result, but he was mostly ignored. And so in 1869, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, but he did not know about Mendel and he didn't understand heredity. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we get to evolution. So for about 34, 35 years, nobody really paid attention to Mendel's work. Then in 1900, 3 different scientists got the same results that Mendel did separately. They were working on different experiments, but they got the same outcome. So the genetics of inheritance, we know that characteristics of organisms are controlled by genes on chromosomes, but it's important to realize that this is a fairly new idea because we have only mapped the human genome in the past 20 years. It was completed in 2001, and we are still breaking down the billions and billions of combinations of genes to figure out what causes certain diseases, what causes certain inheritance patterns. We just don't know everything yet. The position of a gene on a chromosome is called a locus, and sexual reproducers, so organisms that have two different parents, get two copies of the same gene, one from each parent, and sometimes they are different versions. So alleles are those different versions, like blue eye versus brown eye. Alleles are independently assorted into gametes. Alleles that are inherited from each parent are the genotypes, what you could have. The ones that are actually expressed are the phenotypes. So these are the traits that an individual actually shows. Homozygotes got two alleles of the same kind, and heterozygotes got two alleles of different kinds. The dominant allele is the expressed trait, and the recessive allele is the trait that is not expressed. So if you will go into, there's another PowerPoint called Punnett Square practice. That's where we're going next.